Elon Musk walked into the prestigious university's calculus classroom, his presence immediately drawing attention from the students, who had been expecting just another routine lecture. The room, packed with some of the brightest young minds, buzzed with whispers and excitement as they recognized the billionaire entrepreneur taking a seat toward the back, seemingly trying to blend in. Some students exchanged glances, wondering why he was there. Was it a guest lecture, a casual visit, or something else entirely? What none of them anticipated, however, was that this ordinary class session would turn into an unforgettable event that would challenge their perceptions of intelligence, learning, and success. At the front of the room stood Dr. Williams, the calculus professor, a man known not only for his mastery of mathematics but also for his strong and often blunt opinions about the world outside academia. He was respected for his intellect, but also feared for his sharp tongue and tendency to belittle those he deemed undeserving of success. And to Dr. Williams, few people embodied that undeserved success more than billionaires like Elon Musk. To the professor, men like Musk were merely fortunate beneficiaries of privilege and circumstance, riding waves of financial advantage rather than achieving anything through raw intellectual ability. He believed that true intelligence belonged in universities, in research institutions, in the realm of academia, not in boardrooms and stock markets. So when he noticed Musk seated among his students, a smirk played on his lips. This was an opportunity to prove that despite all of Musk's accolades, despite his reputation as a so-called visionary genius, he was no match for the rigors of real academic knowledge, especially in a subject as unforgiving as calculus. The professor's eyes gleamed with amusement as he turned to address the class. "Today," he announced, "we'll be tackling some of the most challenging problems in calculus, and since we have a very special guest with us, someone who has built a career on innovation and big ideas, I think it's only fair we see if he can handle some of the real work that goes on in a place like this." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Some students exchanged uneasy glances, aware of Dr. Williams' reputation for ruthlessly exposing those he saw as unqualified. Others leaned forward in anticipation, curious to see if Musk, the man who had sent rockets into space and revolutionized multiple industries, could hold his own in a field as demanding as advanced mathematics. Meanwhile, Musk remained completely unfazed. He met the professor's challenge with nothing more than a small knowing smile and a slight nod, signaling his willingness to participate. The tension in the room thickened. Was Elon Musk truly a mathematical genius, or was he about to be humiliated in front of an entire class? The challenge had been set, and every student in the room was about to witness something they would never forget. Dr. Williams stood at the front of the classroom, the smirk on his face widening as he turned toward the chalkboard, relishing the opportunity to expose what he believed to be the intellectual limitations of Elon Musk. He saw Musk's presence in his classroom as an anomaly, an intruder in an environment where true intelligence was cultivated, not inherited through wealth or status. If Musk was truly as brilliant as the world claimed, if he was more than just a businessman who surrounded himself with talented engineers, then surely he wouldn't mind a little challenge. The professor picked up a piece of chalk and, with a deliberate motion, began writing an equation on the board, one that even his top students struggled with. The problem was filled with complex derivatives, intricate integrals, and mathematical manipulations that required not just memorization but deep theoretical understanding. He knew that even among the brightest students, only a handful could approach solving it with confidence. When he finished, he turned back to the class, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Musk, his expression filled with mock curiosity. "Since we have a special guest with us today," Dr. Williams said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "perhaps Mr. Musk would like to take a crack at this. After all, we often hear about his genius. Let's see how well it holds up in the world of academia." The class fell silent. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the deliberate attempt to put Musk on the spot. Others leaned forward with eager anticipation, waiting to see how the billionaire would react. Would he decline? Would he fumble? Or, against all odds, would he prove himself capable? Musk, however, showed no sign of hesitation. He remained calm, his expression unreadable, before finally standing up. With measured steps, he made his way to the front of the room, the sound of his footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. Dr. Williams handed him the chalk with a barely concealed smirk, fully expecting Musk to hesitate, to falter, to reveal that beyond his wealth and business acumen, he was out of his depth in the world of higher mathematics. Musk took a moment to examine the problem. He studied the equation, his eyes tracing the functions, the limits, the integrals, every detail the professor had deliberately chosen to ensure difficulty. Dr. Williams watched closely, waiting for signs of confusion, but none came. Instead, Musk simply nodded, gripping the chalk with steady confidence. Then, without a word, he began to write. The class watched in stunned silence as Musk worked through the equation, his movements precise, his logic methodical. The chalk moved swiftly across the board, his calculations flowing seamlessly from one step to the next. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no frantic rechecking, just a quiet, unwavering certainty. The students exchanged glances, their initial skepticism beginning to shift into disbelief. Even those who had doubted him most could see it. Musk wasn't just guessing, he wasn't bluffing. He understood exactly what he was doing. Dr. Williams' smirk faltered. He had expected Musk to struggle, to reveal that his reputation was built on the brilliance of others, not his own. But instead, he was watching the opposite unfold. Musk wasn't just keeping up, he was excelling. The professor cleared his throat, feigning indifference, but inside he felt something creeping in that he hadn't expected. Doubt. His challenge had backfired. Musk had risen to it without a hint of struggle, and the students, once eager to see their professor expose a fraud, now watched with growing admiration. Dr. Williams knew he couldn't back down now, not yet. If Musk could handle one problem, he would have to take things to the next level. With a forced chuckle, he erased the first equation and, with swift, deliberate strokes, replaced it with one even more complicated. "All right, Mr. Musk," he said, masking his frustration. "Let's see if you can handle this one." The class held its breath as Musk, still calm, still composed, nodded once again, picked up the chalk, and prepared to prove himself all over again. The room remained eerily silent as Elon Musk took a step back, momentarily scanning the second, even more complex equation Dr. Williams had written on the board. The professor stood with his arms crossed, a forced smirk still lingering on his face, but those who knew him well could see the slight tension in his jaw, the subtle tightening of his fingers against his sleeve. He had expected Musk to fumble with the first problem, to reveal himself as nothing more than a businessman who happened to employ brilliant engineers. Instead, Musk had tackled it with astonishing speed and accuracy, leaving the class in stunned disbelief. Now, with an even greater challenge in front of him, the question lingered in the air. Was it luck? Or was he truly as intelligent as people claimed? The students sat at the edge of their seats, their gazes fixed on Musk, some whispering to each other in hushed voices. "No way he does it again," one student muttered. "This one's insane." Another shook their head, watching Musk with newfound curiosity. Musk, however, appeared entirely unfazed. He reached for the chalk, gripped it with the same confidence as before, and without a word he began. The chalk tapped against the board as he worked through the initial steps, his movements smooth and precise, never hesitating, never second-guessing. The class watched in growing astonishment as each line of work flowed seamlessly into the next, his approach methodical yet effortless, as if he had been solving problems of this caliber his entire life. The murmurs among the students grew louder. Some began scribbling notes, trying to follow along, their own curiosity overtaking any lingering doubt. Others simply stared, their minds racing to comprehend how Musk, a man who had spent the majority of his career in business and technology, was handling an advanced calculus problem with the skill of a seasoned mathematician. Dr. Williams, despite his earlier bravado, was no longer smirking. His fingers twitched slightly at his side as he watched Musk solve each step with unnerving accuracy. He had spent years refining his teaching methods, challenging students to think critically, to push beyond their perceived limits. Yet here was a man who had not only kept up with those challenges, but had surpassed every expectation set against him. The professor's mind raced. Had he misjudged Musk entirely? Had he been blinded by his own biases, assuming that business success and academic brilliance were mutually exclusive? He had spent his career believing that true intellect belonged within the walls of academia, cultivated through years of structured education. And yet, the man standing before him had just dismantled that belief without saying a single word. As Musk reached the final steps of the equation, he paused briefly, checking his work, then completed the final calculation. He underlined his answer, set the chalk down, and turned to face the class. The room was dead silent. Every student's gaze flickered between the board and Musk, their expressions ranging from shock to deep admiration. A few exchanged glances, as if seeking reassurance that they weren't imagining what had just happened. Dr. Williams took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the board, reading through each step, searching for an error, a flaw, something, anything that would discredit what had just transpired. But there was nothing. Every calculation was flawless, every step logically sound. The truth was undeniable. The silence was finally broken by a whisper in the back of the room. "He actually did it," a student muttered in disbelief. Another let out a low whistle, shaking their head. Even those who had doubted him the most could not deny what had just taken place. Dr. Williams, despite himself, felt a grudging respect settle in. This was not the outcome he had anticipated. He had expected Musk to falter, to expose himself as an amateur outside of his own industry. Instead, he had watched as Musk, without arrogance or hesitation, proved himself to be not just a businessman, but a true intellectual force. And now the class saw it too. Dr. Williams clenched his jaw as he wiped the board clean, his mind racing to come up with a problem so challenging, so intricate, that it would finally push Elon Musk to his limits. He had underestimated him once, then twice, and now the professor felt the weight of his own misjudgment pressing down on him. His intention had been to expose Musk as someone whose so-called genius was overhyped, built on the labor of the engineers and scientists he employed. Instead, he had watched as Musk solved each equation with a level of skill that even his top students struggled to match. If there was ever a moment to reclaim control of the classroom, to remind everyone that academia was where true intelligence was tested, it was now. With a determined expression, he picked up the chalk and began to write, his strokes deliberate and unyielding. The problem he constructed was unlike the previous ones. Not just difficult, but an amalgamation of multiple advanced calculus principles, requiring deep theoretical knowledge and the ability to recognize intricate patterns. The students, even the brightest among them, recognized its sheer complexity the moment the professor stepped back. Murmurs rippled through the room, some students shifting uneasily in their seats, others glancing toward Musk with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright disbelief. This was not just a difficult problem. It was one that required intuition, experience, and an almost instinctual understanding of mathematics. Dr. Williams exhaled slowly before turning to Musk, his voice more measured now, stripped of its earlier mockery. "If you're as brilliant as they say, let's see how you handle this." There was no arrogance this time, no sarcastic edge. This was a real challenge, one meant for only the most skilled minds. A part of him still expected Musk to hesitate, to finally reveal that he had reached the limits of his knowledge. But Musk, as he had done before, merely nodded, stepping forward with the same quiet confidence that had unnerved the professor from the beginning. He studied the equation for a long moment, longer than before, his eyes tracing each line, absorbing its complexity. For the first time, there was hesitation. Not in uncertainty, but in careful calculation. The classroom was so quiet that even the faintest movement seemed deafening. The students watched intently, sensing the weight of the moment. Musk took a deep breath and finally moved, chalk in hand, beginning the first steps of the solution. His pace was different this time, not slow but measured, each stroke of chalk deliberate, each step carefully considered. He worked through the layers of the problem, breaking it down piece by piece, navigating through its complexities with precision. But there were moments when he paused, thinking, adjusting his approach, his mind visibly engaged in the intricate dance of problem-solving. The room was transfixed, watching him work through something that even the professor had deemed nearly impossible. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Dr. Williams, despite himself, found his own breath caught in his chest as he observed Musk's approach. It wasn't just about getting the right answer. It was about the process, the intuition, the sheer depth of understanding Musk demonstrated as he tackled each segment of the equation. Some students were furiously scribbling notes, trying to follow along. Others sat still, mesmerized by the methodical genius unfolding before them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Musk reached the final step. He paused for a fraction of a second, then with a final stroke of chalk underlined the answer. The silence was deafening. Every pair of eyes in the room flickered between the board and Musk, waiting for the professor's verdict. Dr. Williams took a slow step forward, his gaze scanning the board, checking for errors, for even the slightest flaw. His fingers twitched slightly as he traced each calculation, his breath shallow. Then, after a long, heavy pause, he exhaled. The answer was correct, perfect, complete. The professor, a man who had built a career on his expertise in mathematics, had to accept the truth. Elon Musk had solved the ultimate challenge, and in that moment, for the first time since the class had begun, Dr. Williams had no words. The weight of the moment settled over the classroom like a thick fog, heavy with disbelief and quiet awe. The students, who had entered this lecture expecting nothing more than another challenging calculus lesson, now found themselves witnessing something entirely different, something that defied their expectations and forced them to rethink everything they believed about intelligence, success, and even education itself. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur they had once seen as merely a businessman, had just solved the most difficult calculus problem they had ever encountered. Not only had he done it correctly, but he had done it with a level of patience, logic, and skill that left even the brightest among them feeling humbled. The shift in their perspective was undeniable. Just hours ago, many of them had assumed Musk's success was a result of luck, wealth, or the brilliance of the people he hired. Now they saw him in a different light, not just as a leader in technology and business, but as a thinker, a problem solver, a man whose intellect was as sharp as his ambition. At the front of the room, Dr. Williams stood frozen, staring at the board, his mind struggling to reconcile what had just happened. His carefully crafted plan to expose Musk's so-called false genius had completely unraveled. He had believed, with unwavering certainty, that Musk's intelligence had been exaggerated, that he was nothing more than a savvy businessman who capitalized on the brilliance of others. But now, staring at the flawless solution on the board, he realized the truth. Musk wasn't just brilliant in business, he was brilliant, period. The professor's chest tightened, not just from the embarrassment of being proven wrong in front of his students, but from the deeper realization that he had let his own prejudices cloud his judgment. He had assumed intelligence belonged only to those within the walls of academia, that those who didn't dedicate their lives to research and theoretical work couldn't possibly match the intellectual rigor of scholars. But Musk had just shattered that belief, without uttering a single boastful word. Breaking the stunned silence, a young woman near the front raised her hand hesitantly. Her voice was quiet but filled with curiosity. "Mr. Musk," she asked, "how do you know all of this? I mean, you're not a professor, you don't teach math for a living, so how did you learn it so well?" Musk turned to her, his expression warm yet thoughtful. "I studied it when I was younger," he said simply. "Math has always been important to me, especially in engineering and physics. If you want to understand how the world works, how to build things, how to innovate, you need to understand math." His words resonated deeply. The students, many of whom had viewed calculus as an abstract and tedious requirement, now saw it as something more, a key to unlocking innovation, creativity, and real-world impact. For the first time, they weren't just looking at Elon Musk as a billionaire. They were looking at him as an example of what was possible when knowledge and curiosity came together. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted from stunned disbelief to something entirely different. Pure engagement. The students, who had entered the room expecting another dry, formula-heavy calculus lecture, now sat with rapt attention, their eyes fixed on Elon Musk, not just as a billionaire or a guest, but as a teacher. He stood at the board, chalk still in hand, but this time, instead of simply solving problems, he took a step back and looked at the class. "Calculus isn't just about memorizing formulas or solving equations for a test," he began, his voice calm but carrying a quiet conviction. "It's about understanding how things change, the rate of acceleration of a rocket, the curve of an electric car's energy efficiency, the way planets move through space." It's all calculus. He gestured toward the board, but his focus wasn't on the equation anymore. It was on the students, drawing them in, making them see that the numbers and symbols weren't just abstract concepts, but tools to unlock the world around them. For years, many of these students had viewed math as something mechanical, a subject they had to push through in order to get a good grade or pass an exam. But Musk was presenting it as something alive, something that had real-world applications far beyond the confines of a classroom. You don't have to be a mathematician to use math, he continued. You just have to be curious enough to ask the right questions. If you can understand relationships between things, you can figure out almost anything. He began breaking down the problem he had just solved, explaining it in a way that made even the most complex parts feel approachable. He simplified the logic behind the solution, not by dumbing it down, but by framing it in a way that made sense. Why each step was necessary, how one part flowed into the next, and how the same principles applied not just in textbooks, but in real-world engineering, physics, and even business. The students were mesmerized. Some of them leaned forward, others scribbled notes furiously, not because they had to, but because for the first time they wanted to. Even Dr. Williams, who had spent years refining his teaching methods, found himself watching Musk with an uncomfortable realization. He wasn't just solving equations, he was making them meaningful. He wasn't just instructing, he was inspiring. Musk continued, drawing parallels between calculus and space exploration, explaining how engineers at SpaceX used similar mathematical principles to calculate rocket trajectories and optimize fuel efficiency. When you think of math this way, he said, it stops being something you just learn for a test. It becomes a tool for building the future. And at that moment, every student in the room could feel it, the weight of possibility, the realization that learning wasn't about memorization, but about discovery. Elon Musk hadn't just proven he understood calculus, he had made them want to understand it too. Dr. Williams stood at the front of the room, his arms still crossed, but the confidence he had once exuded had been replaced with something else entirely. He had started this lecture with the intention of proving a point, that Elon Musk, despite all his success in business and technology, was not on the same intellectual level as those who had spent their lives immersed in academia. But now, as he watched Musk engage with the students, explaining calculus in a way that made it feel accessible and relevant, he felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. His carefully constructed notions about intelligence, expertise, and who deserved respect in an academic setting were beginning to crumble before his eyes. He had always believed that the world of business and the world of academia were separate, that true intellectual rigor belonged to universities and research institutions, not corporate boardrooms. And yet, standing in front of him was a man who had mastered both, seamlessly bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The students, who had once feared Dr. Williams's sharp tongue and ruthless critiques, now sat with their full attention on Musk, absorbing every word he said. They were engaged in a way that was rare in any classroom, their expressions filled with curiosity rather than obligation. Musk wasn't just answering their questions, he was igniting something within them, a passion for learning that went beyond the desire for good grades or academic validation. And it was in that moment that Dr. Williams realized the depth of his miscalculation. He had spent years lecturing about the importance of understanding, about pushing oneself to think beyond memorization and formulas. But here was a man who had done exactly that, and he had tried to discredit him before even giving him a chance. He had assumed Musk's success was built purely on business instincts, on the brilliance of the people he surrounded himself with. But now, he saw what he had been too blinded by his own biases to recognize. Musk's success wasn't just financial or entrepreneurial, it was intellectual, built on a relentless pursuit of knowledge, on a mind that never stopped questioning, never stopped learning. For years, Dr. Williams had prided himself on being an educator, someone who could recognize true talent and cultivate it. But now, as he stood there watching his own students look at Musk with admiration and respect, he wondered if he had been teaching them the wrong lesson all along. He had believed that intelligence was something that belonged to a select few, those who had earned their place through academic rigor and institutional validation. But Musk had just shattered that idea. He had shown that intelligence wasn't confined to universities or research labs. It could be found anywhere, in anyone who had the curiosity and determination to pursue it. Dr. Williams took a slow breath, feeling an unfamiliar sense of humility creeping in. He had misjudged Musk not because of his lack of intelligence, but because of his own preconceived notions about what intelligence was supposed to look like. He had assumed that success in business and true academic brilliance couldn't coexist, that someone like Musk couldn't possibly possess the same level of intellectual depth as a scholar. But now he knew he had been wrong, and for the first time he felt the weight of that realization settle over him. The students had already recognized it. Their perspective on Musk had shifted long before his own had. They saw him for what he truly was, not just a billionaire or an entrepreneur, but a thinker, an innovator, someone who approached learning not as a means to an end, but as a lifelong pursuit. As Musk finished his explanation and set the chalk down, a student hesitantly raised their hand. "Professor," they said, turning toward Dr. Williams, "do you think we could learn more like this?" The question struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about calculus anymore, it was about education itself. What if he had spent years making learning feel like a burden when it was supposed to be an adventure? He looked at Musk, then at the students, and for the first time in his career he felt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the smartest person in the room. And that was okay, because the best teachers weren't the ones who always had the answers. They were the ones who were willing to keep learning. And at that moment, Dr. Williams knew that today he had learned more than he had taught. The classroom was no longer just a place of lectures and equations. It had become a stage for something far more profound. The students, who had started the day expecting another rigorous but predictable calculus lesson, now sat in silent reflection, their minds racing with new ideas, new perspectives. Elon Musk, the man they had previously known only as a billionaire and an innovator, had just shown them that intelligence was not limited to classrooms, nor was learning something that ended with a diploma. He had demonstrated that curiosity, persistence, and the willingness to challenge oneself mattered just as much, if not more, than traditional academic accolades. The air in the room was thick with the weight of this realization, the moment stretching on as students processed what they had just witnessed. Then, breaking the silence, a young woman raised her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Musk," she asked, her voice laced with something between curiosity and uncertainty, "what if someone isn't naturally good at math? Can they still do something meaningful like you have?" Musk turned to face her, his expression thoughtful, and when he spoke, his words carried none of the arrogance or superiority that so often accompanied those in his position. "Absolutely," he said with quiet conviction. "Math isn't about being born with some special ability. It's about persistence. It's about curiosity. The only difference between the people who are great at something and the ones who struggle is that the great ones never stop trying. If you don't understand something the first time, you figure out another way to approach it. You break it down, you ask questions, you fail, and then you try again. That's how learning works, not just in math, but in everything." His words settled over the room like a revelation, reshaping the way many of these students thought about their own potential. For so long, they had viewed intelligence as something fixed, something you either had or didn't. But Musk was showing them that it was something they could build, something they could develop over time. Dr. Williams, still standing at the front of the classroom, absorbed every word, his earlier frustrations now overshadowed by introspection. He had spent years trying to prove to his students that education was the great separator, that intelligence was something cultivated within institutions like this one. But Musk had just shown them something different. Intelligence wasn't just about where you studied or how many degrees you had. It was about how much you were willing to push yourself, to explore, to keep learning no matter where you were in life. He realized with a strange mix of humility and regret that he had spent so much time guarding the gates of academia that he had overlooked the truth. Real learning wasn't confined to the walls of a university. It was everywhere. The students who had once looked to Dr. Williams for knowledge now looked at Musk with a new kind of respect. Not because he was a billionaire, not because he had proven himself superior in calculus, but because he had reshaped their understanding of what learning really meant. He had taken something they had always seen as rigid and impersonal and made it feel exciting, full of possibilities. If you approach math, or anything else, with the mindset that it's just something to get through, something you either succeed at or fail, you're missing the point, Musk continued. It's not about the grades. It's about understanding how things work, about developing the ability to solve problems. And once you have that ability, it applies to everything: science, engineering, business, even life itself. His words weren't just a lecture, they were an invitation to think differently, to stop seeing learning as an obligation and start seeing it as a tool for unlocking potential. Dr. Williams exhaled slowly, realizing that he had just witnessed something truly rare. His students not just listening but thinking, not just absorbing information but being inspired. And as much as it pained him to admit it, it wasn't he who had done that today. It was Musk. A man he had been so eager to discredit had just done something in an hour that he had struggled for years to achieve. He had made his students want to learn. As Musk finished speaking, the students remained silent for a few moments longer, letting his words settle in. Then, one by one, they started asking questions, not just about calculus, but about engineering, space travel, artificial intelligence, problem solving. Their curiosity had been reignited, and they wanted to know more, to understand more, to push their own limits the way Musk had demonstrated. Dr. Williams looked around the room, watching his students engage in a way he had never seen before. He had entered this day with the intention of teaching Musk a lesson, but in the end it was he who had learned something invaluable. Learning wasn't about proving who was the smartest in the room. It wasn't about guarding knowledge or setting impossible barriers. It was about inspiring others to seek knowledge for themselves. And as he stood there, watching his students absorb this new way of thinking, he knew that today something had changed. Not just for them, but for himself. As the lecture drew to a close, the classroom remained alive with an energy that hadn't been there before. The students, who had initially viewed Elon Musk as just another wealthy businessman, now saw him in an entirely different light. He wasn't just someone who had made billions through clever investments or corporate maneuvering. He was a thinker, a problem solver, and above all, a lifelong student of knowledge. He had walked into their classroom as a guest, but he was leaving as something more. An inspiration, someone who had challenged the way they saw learning, intelligence, and even their own potential. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs, students whispering among themselves, still in awe of what had just transpired. Some sat deep in thought, processing the lesson that had unfolded before them. Not just a lesson in calculus, but a lesson in perseverance, curiosity, and the true nature of intelligence. Musk, gathering his things with the same calm demeanor he had carried throughout the class, turned toward Dr. Williams, whose expression had changed significantly from when the lecture began. The professor, who had started the day eager to expose Musk as an intellectual fraud, now stood in reflective silence, his arms no longer crossed, his usual air of superiority replaced with something closer to humility. The shift had been gradual, but undeniable. He had come into this expecting to teach Musk a lesson about the limits of business minds in an academic setting, but in the end, it was he who had learned something far more valuable. Intelligence wasn't confined to lecture halls and research papers. It wasn't something determined by degrees or titles. It was, at its core, about the relentless pursuit of understanding, the willingness to challenge oneself, to ask questions, to keep pushing forward even when others doubted you. And Musk had just embodied that philosophy in the most undeniable way. The classroom, usually filled with the mechanical routine of note-taker and lectures, now felt different. There was an eagerness in the students that hadn't been there before. They had witnessed something rare, a moment where learning had felt alive, where knowledge had felt like more than just something to memorize for an exam. As Musk moved toward the door, one of the students, unable to hold back any longer, called out, "Mr. Musk, what's the most important thing you've learned?" The room fell silent again as Musk paused, his hand resting on the strap of his bag. He turned back, scanning the faces of the young minds that had just seen him solve equations that had stumped some of the brightest students. But more than that, he saw their curiosity, their hunger for knowledge, something he recognized as the driving force behind everything he had ever done. With a thoughtful smile, he answered, "The most important thing I've learned is that intelligence isn't about knowing everything. It's about never stopping the search for answers. The moment you think you know it all is the moment you stop learning, and when you stop learning, you stop growing. No matter how successful you are, no matter what field you're in, you should always be asking questions. Always be willing to challenge what you know. That's how real progress happens. His words hung in the air, and for a moment it was as if time had slowed. The students absorbed them, some nodding, others scribbling the quote in their notebooks, realizing that they had just been given something far more valuable than just another calculus lesson. They had been given a perspective that would stay with them long after this class was over. Dr. Williams, still standing at the front of the room, took a slow breath before finally speaking. His voice, which had started the class filled with sarcasm and skepticism, now carried something different. Respect. "Mr. Musk," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I have to admit I misjudged you. I thought you were just another businessman who got lucky, but clearly I was wrong." The admission wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He had spent his career measuring intelligence by rigid standards, by degrees, by academic achievement. But Musk had proven that intelligence was something far more fluid, something that couldn't always be measured by conventional means. Musk gave a small nod, his expression understanding. "It's okay, Professor," he replied. "People underestimate others all the time. The important thing is being willing to change your mind when you learn something new." With that, Musk turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a classroom full of students who would never look at learning the same way again. As he stepped out into the hallway, the echoes of his words still lingered, and Dr. Williams watched him go, deep in thought. The professor had started this day trying to prove a point, but in the end, he had been the one who had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Intelligence wasn't about status. It wasn't about wealth or titles. It was about curiosity, about the desire to understand, about the willingness to question everything, including one's own beliefs. As the students gathered their things, still discussing what had happened, Dr. Williams turned back to the board, looking at the equations Musk had solved so effortlessly, and for the first time in a long time he felt something unfamiliar, a renewed sense of wonder, a realization that even as a professor, even after years of teaching, he still had more to learn. One of the greatest lessons in life is that learning never truly ends. No matter how many years we have lived, each day presents an opportunity to grow, to understand, and to expand our perspectives. The story of Elon Musk in the calculus classroom is not just about intelligence. It is about humility, perseverance, and the willingness to embrace lifelong learning. For older adults, this message is particularly powerful. As the world around us continues to change, maintaining a curious and open mind allows us to stay engaged, connected, and fulfilled. A key takeaway from this story is that intelligence is not limited to youth or formal education. Many people assume that learning stops after a certain age, but Musk's example proves otherwise. His ability to solve complex mathematical problems was not the result of recent study, but a lifelong commitment to understanding how the world works. This serves as a reminder that age should never be a barrier to learning new things. Whether it's exploring new technology, picking up a new skill, or simply keeping up with current events, maintaining a habit of curiosity keeps the mind sharp and the spirit young. Another important lesson is the power of humility. Despite his success, Musk did not enter the classroom with arrogance. He accepted the professor's challenge without boasting and responded with patience and grace when the professor realized his mistake. This teaches us that true wisdom is not about proving superiority, but about continuing to learn from every experience. No matter how much we have accomplished in life, there is always something new to discover. And sometimes, the best lessons come from unexpected places. Lastly, this story highlights the importance of keeping an open mind. The professor initially believed that only those within academia could possess true intellectual depth, but he was forced to reconsider his assumptions. In life, it is easy to hold on to old beliefs, but growth comes from being willing to adapt. If we remain open to new ideas, embrace change, and continue seeking knowledge, we can continue to thrive, no matter our age. The key to a meaningful and fulfilling life is not just in what we already know, but in our willingness to keep learning.